Hello everyone, so shall we kick off? I'm Gemma Bolton, I'm on Labour's NEC and also co-chair of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this third session of today's event titled From Black Lives Matter to Kill the Bill, Defend Our Right to Resist, Build a Movement Rooted in Struggle and Solidarity. Today's event is hosted by Arise, a festival of Labour's left ideas, along with a range of left organisations, campaigns and publications, and we're delighted to have so many different speakers and organisations join us for this session today and bringing people together for such an important discussion. The disastrous Tory government is still failing to protect health and people. It's restored to racist scapegoating to distract from their disastrous handling of the pandemic. It's planning further cuts and assaults in the months ahead, as we've heard in previous sessions. In particular, the Tories have resorted to attack after attack on our rights, from the Overseas Operation Bill to the Spy Cops Bill to the proposed policing bill. They've also again and again attacked the inspiring global Black Lives Matter movement. Now more than ever, we must both oppose those who seek to use racism to divide us and defend all our rights together, building a movement across our communities to stand up to the Tories. And at the same time, we've seen Labour's leadership not provide the opposition we need on key issues. The question now is, what do we do about these Tory attacks? Last year, despite the problems of organising posed by the pandemic, we saw many communities, trade unions and campaigners on all popular different causes take a stand against the Tories' reactionary agenda. Our speaker from the People's Assembly, Helen O'Connor, alongside Diane, Abbott MP and Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, will be looking at how we must stand with all those resisting this agenda, develop further the social movements and campaigns that can build, link up and coordinate resistance, and also how this relates to our vital ongoing campaigning in the Labour Party itself for democracy, for socialist policies, and vitally taking the fight to the Tories. As the session goes on, please post questions in the comments below the stream on YouTube or in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we'll put some of those to our panel. You can also please donate at the link provided so Rise can continue hosting these important events and support other campaigns and links that get put in the chat throughout the event. Our speakers for this vital discussion on the crisis and the alternative will all introduce themselves and talk for about 8 minutes each, and then we'll move on to your questions. Our first speaker yesterday celebrated joining Parliament 34 years ago as the first Black woman Member of Parliament. What a historic, inspiring achievement. So please welcome Diane Abbott MP. You're on mute, Diane.
Thank you very much, Gemma. And thank Arise for inviting me to this meeting here today. The theme of the meeting is Socialist Solutions to the Crisis. And let me begin by saying that one solution to the crisis that will not work is giving in to a reactionary narrative about society on the basis that, say, polling tells you it's popular with some people some of the time. We will all have listened to and picked up on the debate around footballers taking the knee at the EU championships. We will all have heard about and seen so-called football fans booing their team because some of them took the knee in recognition of the importance of the fight for anti-racism. Why you can call yourself the fan of a team and boo them, I would not understand. And why you would object to people recognizing the importance of fighting racism, I would not understand either. One of the very heartening things about the England team is how you've seen white players and black players united in trying to set out their clear opposition to racism. And yet, although the issues seem to me reasonably clear, and at least some of those football fans booing, certainly they were all, none of them genuine fans, otherwise they couldn't possibly boo their team, but also at least some of them were racist, despite the fact that the Tories sought to use this issue to play into their toxic so-called culture war narratives, we heard nothing about it from the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. It took Gordon Brown, actually, a day or so ago, to speak out and criticise Boris. And then, when Boris had actually done a U-turn on his original position, which sought to somehow defend or explain away the booing English fans, it's literally 7 hours after Boris did his U-turn that Keir Starmer said anything critical about the booing and what it stood for. That is not the type of leadership that will get us out of the crisis. And that is not what you call socialist leadership in a crisis. But I wanted to focus on a part of the struggle for socialism, which is the struggle for an integrated socialist approach to domestic policy and international policy. When Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, you found people allegedly on the left who would say, you know, they supported him on domestic policy, they supported him on trade union rights, they supported him on housing, but they weren't so keen on when Jeremy wanted to talk and campaign on international policy, be it Israel-Palestine, be it what was happening in Africa, be it what was happening in relation to the US and China. And my argument today is you cannot call yourself a socialist if you seek to de-link domestic policy and international policy. There is an essential link in the relationship between domestic and international politics, and we as socialists need to understand that link and we need to reaffirm it. Let's take the negative case, the role of our Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the G7. He is clearly revealing the reactionary, the authoritarian, and the English nationalist connection between domestic and international politics. Let's look at the recent record of the Tories. On the one hand, we should welcome the global tax deal, which Rishi Sunak has been crowing about. If it's properly implemented, it means just a little more of the burden of the crisis is borne by big business rather than by ordinary people. But we now know that despite Rishi Sunak's gloating and claiming ownership, at every stage of those negotiations, the British government played a reactionary role. The original proposal was for a 21% tax rate, which the British government watered down to 15%. Now the British government is trying to get big banks exempted entirely from the new global tax deal to protect their friends and donors in the City of London. Or let's look at what the World Health Organization is calling the moral catastrophe of rich Western countries failing to provide vaccine to the rest of the world. Joe Biden says he'll provide 500 million vaccine doses. Boris Johnson says he'll provide 100 million doses. We will see. Boris is also saying that he will lead on vaccinating the world. But the world population is considerably bigger than all the G7 is likely to pledge. How many they actually provide, how many vaccines they actually provide, whilst people are dying in huge numbers, will probably be a smaller figure. But we cannot forget, despite these promises of vaccine doses, who has been blocking the waiver of vaccine patents at the World Trade Organization? A waiver of patents is vital in allowing global large-scale production of generic vaccines. Biden initially vetoed the patent waiver, but he's now come around. But it's the government in this country and other G7 countries who are hoarding vaccines and blocking the patent waiver. Clearly, for Britain and most of the G7 countries, the profits of big pharma are more important than people's lives. We also need to look at the pernicious role that Britain is playing on climate change. Yes, we have reduced emissions, but that's not necessarily to do with conscious Tory government policy. North Sea oil is running down. We have continued long-term deindustrialization in this country. But now is the time for decisive action. And what we have learnt recently is actually Britain has no plan to deliver our targets to reduce emissions. Finally, I want to talk to an international issue close to home. That's the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Northern Ireland Protocol, which you'll have heard a lot about in the media, it is part of the Brexit Treaty, and despite what Boris and his ministers are saying, it has the force of international law. But because the English nationalists in the Tory government don't like the treaty they actually signed, they are inciting loyalists in Northern Ireland against it. And who says that? No less a person than the US President Joe Biden. The American ambassador has formally rebuked the British government for inflaming tensions in Ireland and having no regard for the effect inflaming tensions about the protocol will have on peace or the Good Friday Agreement. When Lord Frost, Boris's representative, went to Belfast recently, the only political forces he met with were the Loyalist Communities Council. That shows you how committed Boris is to an even-handed approach to the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Tory efforts to rip up the Northern Ireland Protocol trample over the will of the people of Ireland who oppose Brexit and who support the protocol. Johnson is allying with the most reactionary groupings in Northern Ireland. So we see in Boris Johnson a government that's to the right of Biden on public spending. Biden has given an enormous boost to household incomes, whilst Johnson is freezing pay in the public sector, encouraging fire and rehire, and has raised income tax on ordinary people. Of course, the Labour Party leadership should be calling them out on all this, but I'm not holding my breath. These all show that international politics are completely bound up with national politics. There are some on the left, and I reference that, speaking about what some people said when Jeremy was leader, who think that the left should stick to so-called bread and butter issues. But if we only, as a movement, stuck to bread and butter issues, there would be no Good Friday Agreement, there'd be no Climate Change Act, there'd be no campaign around Windrush, and there'd be no commitment from socialists to anti-racism. So our socialist project cannot just be about bread and butter issues, but those alone do not win hearts, minds, or elections. Instead, we should offer something else as well. Many people are disappointed by how poorly we are doing in the polls and how poorly the leadership is doing. I believe that as well as the short-term bread and butter issues, we have to offer the British people a vision, and that vision has domestic and foreign policy absolutely intertwined. And at home and abroad, we need to offer people socialist values, socialist thinking, and socialist outcomes. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was brilliant. Our next speaker is human rights campaigner and Labour member of the House of Lords, who held the Tories to account on the Spy Cops bill when, to be honest, the Labour front bench were nowhere to be seen. So please welcome Shami Chakrabarti.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, Arise, for inviting me. And thanks to everyone for giving up this time on a Saturday afternoon. It is always a pleasure and a privilege to follow my dear friend and comrade sister, the great Diane Abbott. And happy anniversary, Diane, yet again. I think it must be our age, but these anniversaries seem to come around a bit quicker these days. And it feels like I eat breakfast every 15 minutes. but never mind, we're still here, we're surviving. And I think what you've all heard from Diane just now was a wisdom born of experience and built on values, and that ultimately is what our politics and our campaigning has to be about. I'm going to address the bit of the agenda which is about the right to resist, because the organisers very cleverly identified a trajectory from Black Lives Matter to kill the bill. In other words, they are pointing us towards a very, very worrying authoritarian and actually far right trend in British politics under the Johnson government. And I think it's I think amongst friends we can call it out. It might not seem an elegant thing to say in polite company, but we are now seeing something that isn't even a traditional Conservative government, with all the problems that come with that. We are seeing Boris Johnson playing from the Steve Bannon playbook at a time when the hard men of the world have been doing so much damage to their domestic populations, have been making the worst fist of the pandemic, but are have been in real danger, to say the least, of damaging what's left of the post-World War II international rules-based infrastructure and the institutions born out of that period. So the crucialenges are really quite significant. And I want to talk about the threats, but then move on to how we combat them and how we crucially how we defend this right to resist, because there would be no progressive politics, there would be no fundamental rights and freedoms at all without ultimately the right to resist identified by the organisers today. So the threats, I think you know them well. I don't think I need to speak in too much detail about the trajectory that that Boris Johnson has chosen. Now, we know that he is a shapeshifter. We know that, Boris Johnson, who was running for Labour mayor, would talk about immigration amnesties, even occasionally speak in favour of the Human Rights Act, when New Labour was trying its own version of authoritarianism 20 years ago, when Diane and I became comrades in arms and friends over issues like 90 days and 42 days. And I urge people who haven't read it to look up Diane's legendary House of Commons speech against 42 days. When that was all happening, Boris Johnson was presenting himself as quite a liberal stroke libertarian conservative who cared about fundamental rights and freedoms, who cared about civil liberties. He, as editor of The Spectator, wrote pamphlets against compulsory ID cards and so on. But he has been on a very, very different trajectory in recent years. Now, of course, he famously wrote 2 articles and then picked a side in Brexit. And I don't want to open up rows about Brexit. I have no doubt that people disagreed on that issue, in many of them in very good faith, including in the Labour movement, including on the left. But there's a particular strain of the Brexit argument that Johnson chose to side with that is undoubtedly about populist nationalism. That's not historically true of everyone who is a critic of the European Union. It's not true of everyone who campaigned for or even voted for Brexit, but it was true of the can of worms that Nigel Farage and, yes, Boris Johnson opened up. And it was never going to be satisfied. The xenophobic appetite was never going to be satisfied by Brexit alone, particularly when in the same period as that campaign, Johnson and co, and Cummings, the new great whistleblower, Dominic Cummings, you may remember that he wasn't always so conscience-ridden. When he was guiding Johnson and others, they were very much playing to the Steve Bannon playbook. And there's a very, very startling film that is worth watching. I think you can find it online, called The Brink, from a few years ago, where you see Steve Bannon talking to Nigel Farage about his plan to unite populist nationalists around the world and to educate them in his awful techniques of divide and rule. So we're still on that trajectory. There's also something very thin-skinned and retributive about the Johnson administration. So you'll remember the prorogation case of 2019. Johnson Co had literally illegally shut down Parliament, an extraordinary thing to happen in a democracy, done by executive fiat. This is the sort of thing that you can imagine the kind of column that Johnson would have written a few years ago if that had happened elsewhere in the world, particularly in the global south or indeed elsewhere in Europe. But Johnson illegally shut down Parliament. The Supreme Court found that an abuse of power by 11-0, and what's come as a result of that is that Boris Johnson and co now want to clip the wings of the judiciary and dilute judicial review of administrative action, which is, in short, the means by which we can ultimately hold government to the law in the court. So that's an incredibly, incredibly dangerous move, worthy of a tin pot dictatorship, and it's something that we will have to fight. The charge will, as always, be led from this place in politics, but we will have to make coalitions in civil society to defeat attempts to clip the wings of the independent judiciary. So you see that you see that revenge against the judges, like losing 11-0 in the FA Cup final and coming for the referee with a baseball bat. But you also see this police bill, which follows, as Gemma indicated, the odious spy cops legislation and overseas operations bill. But this police bill is about shutting down peaceful dissent on the streets. Not violent dissent, but noisy, inconvenient dissent. And it is an astonishing piece of legislation that led even Theresa May, the former Conservative Prime Minister, to warn Johnson about what she called a fine line between being popular and populist. Well, I'm afraid it's not such a fine line, and I think it was crossed some time ago. And make no mistake, this is a direct response from this government to Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion in particular, which leads me to the generational issues here, because it is an attack on the younger generation in politics, in particular, who are radicalized by the events of recent years, going back to the Iraq War, but also to years of austerity following the crash. No wonder shape-shifting Johnson said yesterday that we need to be careful not to repeat the mistakes of 2008. I mean, he's saying that in a way to mollify President Biden, his new wannabe best friend, but up to now he has been waging war on youthful idealism and the politics of wanting to tackle structural racial injustice in particular, and Extinction Rebellion and the wider environmental movement, green being the new red. It seems to me obvious to everyone, because the right in the United Kingdom have a particular problem with Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion, and indeed dealing with structural inequality and with climate catastrophe, because they don't want to change the economic status quo. And you cannot tackle these problems. I'm afraid I cannot see how you can logically, rationally address these major problems facing the planet without an economic adjustment. And that is Johnson's problem with younger voters in particular. And if we're not careful, Labour will lose those voters to the Greens. It seems to be happening already, and that is very concerning indeed. And this is where the so-called war on woke comes from. This is why the attack is on universities. This is why, in the middle of a pandemic, we have Conservative ministers obsessed with the minutiae of what's happening in student unions. It's an attack on the Enlightenment values that are bred by higher education. It is an attack on the idealism and the radicalism of the young, make no mistake. We have in Priti Patel one of the most frightening Home Secretaries that I can remember, and I can remember quite a few, as can Diane. I think we first met in a TV studio the day that my noble friend David Blunkett resigned as Home Secretary, and she gave me a look, and I think we knew we were going to be on the same side of a few battles in the years ahead. So we've seen some pretty scary Home Secretaries of different persuasions, but Priti Patel is pretty scary. Let's remember that this woman spoke in favour of the death penalty on national television just 10 years ago. So that is who we're dealing with, and she is the person who would presumably willingly send the gunboats out for asylum seekers in the English Channel and so on. This is how she's identified herself and painted herself as a politician. And we've now got voter suppression. Again, going to the American Bannon far right playbook. It's not enough that we have this thumping majority at the moment. We want to keep things that way by discouraging and suppressing the electorate, particularly young and working class and poorer and minority voters. And that's why you see this promise in the Queen's speech. It's all about divide and rule, and it's all about authoritarianism. How do we respond to it? Well, we unite the very groups and social movements that are under attack. We draw our strength from that collectivism. Young people, minorities, so often relied upon by the Labour movement and Labour and the Labour Party at election time, but not often properly included and given a proper voice in the movement. And now more than ever, it's time to get back to connecting with wider social movements like the movements for racial justice and the movements against climate catastrophe. We also, of course, though, need to make common cause with some unusual suspects, and against the police bill in particular, which is a crackdown on peaceful dissent, noisy protest. What's the point of a protest that isn't noisy? In that struggle, there will be some unusual suspects. There will be people who were noisy campaigners for and against Brexit. There were people who campaigned in favour of fox hunting, but the principle that's at stake is peaceful dissent in a democracy that isn't just about voting every year and then being like international solidarity from the progressives and radicals in the United States, who have done so well in recent times, not just at getting Trump out of office, but of actually pulling President Trump a little further to progress than some of us had expected on issues like climate catastrophe, but also the TRIPS waiver that Diane mentioned. It is absolutely obscene, and I say this as someone whose parents came from India. It is absolutely obscene that those who will not support the TRIPS waiver say that countries like India and South Africa aren't capable of producing vaccines, when in recent months India, whilst experiencing devastation because the poor in some respects, has been producing vaccines to export and the West, while there are bodies floating along the Ganges. We will need to work, yes, sometimes with the old media that's not always been very supportive of us, but goodness me, the BBC is under threat now from the Tories, no question. We have a vibrant new media that is increasingly led by young people. We have community groups and organisations, and we need to be working in those communities. And yes, I would say this, we need to strategic litigation as well as street protest. We can do all of this. We have done it before. We are not devoid of ideas and of values and of solidarity. We must rise to the current challenge because nobody else will. Because when the far right is on the streets, who is it that always responds throughout British history and throughout world history? It is the young, it is minorities, it is the left. And it's to that challenge that I know we can come together and rise. Listening.
Thank you, Shami. I couldn't agree more. And next speaker is from the People's Assembly Against Austerity. The People's Assembly was set up 13 years ago to fight against the austerity agenda, and since then hundreds of thousands of people have marched at their rallies and protests. So please welcome Helen O'Connor.
Thank you so much, Gemma, for inviting me to speak, and congratulations, Diane, for your long tenure as an MP, a true trailblazer, in my opinion. So I'd like to start by talking about the scale of the attacks that are taking place in our class, the working class. The bulk of the wealth, which is generated by our class in the first place, and that should be invested into wages and into social wages like education and the NHS, is being diverted away into the transnational companies. The government has used this public health crisis to enrich their friends and their class. And the price of that was the PPE scandal, which cost lives, the test, track and trace scandal, which cost lives, the herd immunity ideology, which cost lives. The attacks I've mentioned are tearing apart the very fabric of society, and this will create problems for all of us. Inequality and uneven wealth distribution will lead to a rise in every single social ill, things like mental illness, addiction, increased crime rates, sexual exploitation, and violence. This has been borne out in research and in the experience of other countries. Poverty is now becoming even more widespread and entrenched. Already, more than 500,000 people who have no formal residential status in this country are being denied access to free healthcare in the NHS. Homelessness is on the rise, and millions of children are growing up in abject poverty. And how can we possibly expect any of these children to grow up and live healthy and productive lives? We all know that the gap between the very richest and the poorest has been widening over the past 30 years, and the pandemic has accelerated this direction of travel. No one, including all of us on this call, our families, our children, grandchildren, will escape the impact of an unequal society where there's rising poverty, rising insecurity, and where our public services like the NHS are being dismantled by a deliberate program of cuts and privatization. The NHS, the welfare state, social housing, free education, and all of the social wages that working people are entitled to, and which previous generations of working class people fought hard to secure, are now all being slowly removed. Over the past decade, we've seen the rise of the so-called gig economy. These companies, these employers cheat workers out of wages, and the workers who work for these companies are treated like they're less than human beings. And it is the Black and the Asian and the Latino workers who are bearing the brunt of these attacks from brutal employers in the gig economy and from the private companies operating in our NHS and in the other areas. And these workers can't even get facilities to have hot food, they can't get toilet breaks, and many now cannot even rely on being paid in full for hours worked. And everybody says Black Lives Matter, but on a daily basis, the vast majority of Black workers can clearly see that their lives don't matter. And this is reflected in their pay, their terms, and their conditions. And the latent racism that runs through the way these workers are treated by employers is destroying opportunities and life chances for their children too. When the delivery of services becomes about generating profit, those services deteriorate. Privatization is making our hospitals less safe. Even before the pandemic, we saw a clear correlation between the outsourcing of cleaning services and the rise of infection in hospitals. And reducing quality in the pay, terms, and conditions of workers across the board is targeted, and it's deliberate to protect profit. Lack of access to public services, including the NHS, is growing. The mainstream press and the media are not mounting any serious challenge to any of this. The idea that we have a genuinely free press in this country simply isn't true. During this pandemic, we've seen scandal after scandal reported, but no genuine and proper accountability. Laws can be broken by government and their rich backers without them suffering any criminal consequences. How differently the laws work for the rest of us. How differently the police and the courts react to ordinary people who want to take up our legitimate right to protest. The fact is that the real truth that's going on with the NHS and public services is only being put out there by the trade unions and campaign groups like the People's Assembly. What we have seen is isolated struggles against assaults on workers' rights and human rights. The Black Lives Matter protests were a stunning example of the potential power when Black, white people, youth, older people all stand together as one. And when trade union solidarity and strength is applied, workers can also win struggles against employers. Across the country, outsourced workers have held trade union protests, they've taken strike action, and they've faced up to and won victories against big transnational companies like ISS and others. But it is clear that their right to engage in struggle is now under threat. And the bitter and the brutal reality is that so many struggles have been lost as well. Our movement must examine ourselves and how we have responded to the scale of attacks on standards of living and public services. For years, too many in our movement accepted the lie that there was no money as the richest in society were all busy increasing their wealth. And others accepted the lie that private companies could improve public services when all they've done is fragment services, drive workers into poverty, reduce trade union strength, and reduce standards to the point that services are now becoming unsafe. Unions have to face up to the fact that too often we've bent over backwards to avoid conflict with employers, and we've swapped serious shop floor organising of workers and members for servicing work and partnership working with employers. We must learn from these mistakes, and we must move away and do things differently. And in the unions, there is a real and pressing need for us to come together and to organise our members properly to robustly oppose public service restructuring, redundancies, service and job losses. And we must form deep links with trades councils, community campaigns and the public to assist us in the important work we're doing to defend our services and the workers within them. So let us set out our demands on the NHS and on the wider defence of the public sector, our demands on pay, for proper funding for the front line and for the workers doing the necessary work that actually keeps the country running, for workplace safety, for housing, for free healthcare, free education, and for all human beings to be treated with dignity and respect. And let's demand all of the things necessary to renew and rebuild the foundations for a healthy society for every last person in this country. Our rights and freedoms are being restricted like never before, as has already been said, and this has been further ramped up by the Tories. Various governments over the years have attacked our right to withdraw our labour. We already have the most repressive anti-trade union legislation in the Western world. And isn't it funny that the ruling class, the Tories, who are always going on about bureaucracy and wanting less regulation, want to legislate and regulate to death the mass democratic organisations of the working class, the trade unions, and this is about stopping campaigning and stopping strike action. And now they want to go a stage further. They want to restrict our right to protest and to take to the streets, as has already been said. And a police bill making its way through Parliament will make it unlawful to protest if you annoy people. The entire point of protest is to leverage our collective power. And yes, this is annoying for the ruling class and those who own and control everything it's meant to be. What the police bill shows, however, is there's a deep-rooted fear of the power of the working class when we all come together. The only way to defend workers and our communities is to engage in the type of organising in our unions, in our social movements, and in our communities that leads to the type of collective activity that seriously challenges the status quo. An important event to kick off this fight back is the National People's Assembly demonstration on Saturday, the 26th of June. This demonstration has been backed by the TUC and many of the trade unions, and we're calling on absolutely everybody to take to the streets with us and to demand a new normal. The full repressive instruments of the state are being sharpened against us, that's really clear, because those who own and control everything are well aware that increasing numbers of working class people will come into trade union and political activity to find ways to protect themselves. So we must build a strong, united movement where we all stand in solidarity with each other and put our demands for a better world, where people come before profit, where we and future generations have a reasonable chance to be healthy, to be educated, to thrive, to have public services that are a genuine safety net, and to go into decent jobs, decent wages, terms and conditions. I believe we're in the fight of our lives, but we can win, but only if we're united and determined as those who are trying to destroy our pay, terms, conditions and our rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. I'm going to go to some questions now. The first question that I've got from the chat asks, how can Labour and trade union activists show Black lives really matter by true anti-racism, not tokenism? So that's quite an interesting question. Diane, did you have anything to contribute to that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, it's important to be allies. There's nothing that can be a little bit more frustrating if you're a person of colour who's trying to organise and trying to raise issues, where it's almost as if other people are speaking for you. So one of the most important things that white activists and white trade unionists can do is be good allies to those people of colour in their union, in their local party who are trying to raise the issues. I also think that it is, as the question implies, important to beware of token issues, although sometimes symbolism is important, but it's also good to think about real issues, what's really happening in the workplace around you or in your local community. I mean, I've known workplaces where the people in charge fancied themselves as very liberal and anti-racist. When you looked at who was in senior positions, who's getting through the glass ceiling, it was never people of colour. So we have to look at real outturns for people of colour, and we have to try and be good allies. Those are the two things I would mention.
Thanks very much, Diane. Did anyone else have anything they'd like to come in with? Helen. I'll go Helen.
Yeah. I think particularly within the trade union movement, it's extremely important to mainstream our equality agenda into organising, because what we're seeing is the most exploitative employers are actually employing, first of all, in the NHS, it's always the migrant workers who end up being outsourced to the private companies in the first place, and the pay terms and conditions are just driven down and people are treated extremely badly. So I think it's really important to pick those workplace leaders amongst those groups of people and start and support them to fight back properly and drive up wages, terms and conditions, because I think that naturally will then create more opportunities for them. We also see situations in hospitals where the private companies, there's no opportunities whatsoever for the Black and the Asian workers to progress, even within the companies themselves. The jobs are put out, they're not advertised, white managers are sort of parachuted in, there's no proper processes, etc. So I think it's really, really important that we mainstream basically our quality around organising.
Thanks. And Shami?
Well, yes, I believe in affirmative action. Obviously, we're slightly limited by the law, but whether formally or informally, the trade union movement in particular needs to, we need more Black and brown faces in senior and public roles, just like we need more women. And I've said this before, I've even said this in a speech to the TUC some years ago, and let's be honest, sometimes you hear some mutterings in the audience, but you know, the trade union movement has to look and feel and sound and be like the people it represents, and we have to put our own house in order before we can tell anybody else about their house and about the street and about the neighborhood and about the country. And we have to do that on the left first. In my report in 2016, I wrote not just about anti-Semitism, but about all forms of racism. And I found a lot of all forms of racism in the Labour movement, but those parts of the report were largely ignored. So I just say, you know, we have to work on ourselves before we can work on the world.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. I have another question now that I think builds quite well on that. And it says, in Glasgow recently, we saw some fantastic direct action from a whole community to stop a racist deportation. And what tactics should we use as a movement to resist the Tories? And how should Labour relate to these more sort of radical forms of protest? Does anybody want to come in on how Labour relates to radical blockading in terms of deportations?
Well, can I say there is a Labour movement tradition which goes back to hundreds of years of taking direct action, because sometimes only direct action will do. And what was really great about the people in Glasgow that came out on the street to stop their neighbour being snatched and deported was they didn't confine themselves to sort of otherising those people. Sometimes it's easy to look at immigrants, people of colour, as other people, and people you're going to be kind to and be nice about, they identified with them wholly and prepared to take direct action. And we need to see more of that. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Well, absolutely. I mean, look, the point about, so here's the potential contradiction. So here's Shami, the lawyer, sitting here, and I should be sitting here squirming and feeling nervous about direct action, but not at all. I mean, the whole point about human rights and the rule of law is that they exist and should be respected and enforced, so that people don't have to take direct action, right? But if people have no choice, they have no choice. And if you look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, if you look at the European Convention on Human Rights, you have in the preambles, it's so people don't have to take up arms, so people don't have to go to war, so people don't have to. I would never say to somebody who is being disempowered to the point of being, we've seen illegal deportations of people who are British nationals, or certainly entitled to be in Britain, that Diane exposed during the Windrush scandal. And now we're seeing laws being passed that are an abomination to human rights. The Spy Cops legislation, which I'm afraid I failed to significantly amend or defeat, that legislation is an abomination to human rights. That legislation allows not just undercover cops, but undercover agents of the state. These can be turned criminals and informants in the community, including paid for by the state, allows them total advanced immunity from crime, right? That is the opposite of law. And when laws like that are, this is a sort of a far right government, when laws like that hit statute book, you have no choice sometimes but to resist by direct action. Now, that doesn't mean you throw your own scruples out of the window. That doesn't mean that you're seeking to be violent and harm people, but it does mean you have to resist. And I think in Helen's earlier wonderful speech and presentation, she touched on something very important, which is that it's one law for them. That the rule of law is about the same standards for everybody. And we've seen from the current government, whether in their legislative agenda or frankly in their conduct due to the pandemic, Barnard Castle, contracts for mates, all the rest of it, it's one law for them and something quite different for everybody else. And as Diane says, that's why we're all in this together, and we have to come together, not as an act of kindness or charity to this group or that group, but because they are the 1% and we are the 99%, and our strength comes in numbers, and those numbers are our strength, whether they're on the street or whether they're on social media or whether they're in people's petitions or at the People's Assembly and so on.
Thank you, Shami. And although you weren't successful in any change on that bill, I think we can all thank you for all the work and all the fight you brought to try to amend it. Helen.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of my life sort of organising outsourced migrant workers, and I think one of the things my members really like to see when they're in a battle or a struggle in the workplace to improve their conditions, they really value, the MPs sort of being right alongside them in the Labour Party on the picket lines, on protests, etc. So we've done some really good work, and I think people like Diane and Jeremy have always kind of like been there, right, standing with the workers, when they're on strikes and whatever, which has been amazing. So that's what we want to see, and we want to see obviously the pressure just being really put on people who exploit people, these big powerful entities that exploit people. So there's lots of ways that the Labour Party can be linked up with the real kind of struggles that go on day to day on the ground, I think.
Absolutely. Thanks, Helen. So the next question that's come in is often quite a difficult one for the Labour Party, I think, but I think it's still worth asking, considering. But it says both the BLM demonstrations and the demonstration against the policing bill raised people demanding to defund the police. And so what does it mean to say you're going to defund the police, and should Labour be supporting that demand? And how does it differ from the cuts to policing that the Tory government has enacted? And Shami, you're probably very well placed to respond.
I think it's a great question, and I don't shrink from it at all. And I think it's really important that our spokespeople, and let's face it, every Labour member is a Labour spokesperson in their community. So I think it's really important that we grasp this nettle and we get it right, because sometimes people have fluffed it, frankly, in quite senior roles in our movement, have fluffed their lines on Black Lives Matter. So let's be absolutely clear. You know, not every slogan crosses the Atlantic that well, but I completely share the sentiment behind that slogan. And it wasn't about saying there should be no policing. It was, what you've got to understand is that the United States is not a welfare state. It's not even a welfare state under austerity. It's a security state. You've got to look at, they have no NHS. Women don't even get maternity leave for a few months. You know, this is a country, the United States, that since Nixon's war on drugs, and possibly even before, has been investing so much of its wealth in mass incarceration. You need to watch that wonderful movie, The 13th, to understand not just the similarities in our trajectory as nations, but our differences. And we do not want to go down that American path. And so what defund the police means in the context of the United States is redirect wealth and precious resources into things like healthcare for people, in things like social care, to things like education and jobs for the young people and Black people in particular. That's what it means. Now, I know that if you don't understand that context, it can look like you're anti-law and order, and quite the opposite. I mean, Diane, and you know, I worked very much with Diane when she was our shadow Home Secretary, and in the last couple of elections, you know, Diane was very much campaigning on investment in proper policing, because police budgets had been cut so badly that rape has been virtually decriminalised in the United Kingdom. So defund the police doesn't mean what some people think it means and the way it's been spun. What it's about is redirecting wealth away from mass incarceration in particular towards the causes of crime, if you like terrible insecurity and substance abuse and mental health problems and all the things that you're better off dealing with, rather than building more and more private supermax prisons.
Helen?
Yeah, so I can understand where the demand for defund the police come from, because we see all the horrors, don't we, in the press, the deaths in custodies, the Sarah Everard vigil, the way women were treated, you know, when we were at a peaceful vigil, police actions escalated tensions. And I think one of the problems with the police, I mean, and I have to say that when I was a nurse in the NHS, I did work closely with the police actually to keep people safe. So sometimes people don't see that side of things and the importance of effective policing. But I think one of the issues is that the police are regulating themselves. And I think there's much more need for external scrutiny actually, and for a review of the police, the attitudes and behaviours of the police towards minority groups and towards women. I think that's essential. Right now, the police exonerated themselves from any wrongdoing at the Sarah Everard vigil, and we were there. We saw what they did. We saw the way they handled that was wrong. You know, so I think there's a need, like I said, for external scrutiny.
Thanks. Diane, was there anything you'd like to add to those very full responses to the question?
Well, just quickly, I couldn't have explained what defunding the police means better than Shami. And I do think, as you said, you need to put it in an American context. And in an American context, what they're talking about is redirecting some of the money that's spent on policing into things like social work and education and so on. And we need to remember as well that what you're seeing in America is a highly militarized police force. And some of the funding it gets is not on, you know, police officers to keep people safe, which I think we would all support, but on semi-militarized vehicles and equipment, stuff our police don't have and wouldn't have. So when people are talking about defunding the US police, they're actually talking about spending less money on military vehicles and firearms, and directing some of that money to the underlying causes of crime. So I think if you explain it, I think people do understand. But it's easy to talk about defunding the police and turning it into an attack on the left, rather than trying to understand what it really means.
Absolutely. Thanks very much all. I have one more question that's been sent in, which the first question sort of spoke about how we can be the best allies within our constituencies. And this one says, what kind of things can we do in our CLPs to support mobilisations such as those around the Black Lives Matter movement or Kill the Bill? And what's the very best way to bring those issues into the party and into the party sort of structures? So it's a slightly different angle. Does anybody else want to come in on that?
Well, just quickly, I mean, I've been in the Labour Party I've been an MP for 34 years and probably in the party for 40 years and more. And the Labour Party, I love the Labour Party. I wouldn't have been in it so long if I didn't love it. But there's sometimes a slight danger in Labour Party meetings to spend an awful lot of time on process and procedure and who gets to be the delegate on this committee and the other committee, and less time talking about actual political issues. So the very simplest thing you can do is try to talk about the political issues in your community rather than who's going to get to be the delegate, or, you know, talk about the actual political issues. And the point about talking about the actual political issues in your party and acting on them, that is how you will build the party in the wider community. I mean, this morning, I was at a demonstration outside what always used to be called the Jeffrey Museum. They now call it the Museum of Home, but it was a Jeffrey Museum. And it was funded and set up by a slave trader. And a number of us as Labour Party people, but also ordinary activists, went and had a demonstration outside there. And, you know, it got a lot of attention from people going past. It was a practical way of the local party showing its position on anti-racism, and that we don't think that we should be glorifying slave traders. So what I'm saying is a little less about procedure and a little more about the actual things that are affecting people in your constituency. Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you, Diane. Does anybody else have anything more to come in on, or any final comments that they'd like to make before we start bringing the session to a close? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to our speakers for all your contributions, and to everyone for participating in sending in questions. Over 1,000 of you have joined over the course of today, which is incredible. And we know that there are really important battles ahead, and also just how important that campaigning against the Tories' divisive agenda is, including from turning Black Lives Matter from a rallying cry into reality, and killing the policing bill for good. Additionally, as this discussion has shown today, there is so much important work to be done in Labour, in our trade unions, in our communities, and through movements such as the People Assembly. And make sure to come along if you can to the rally on June 26th. And more to build resistance against the Tories. Please also take on board the action links that have been posted in the chat, including by donating via the link provided, so that Arise can continue hosting these really important events. So please stay online, don't go anywhere. The next session starts at 3:30 promptly, and it's our international session on A World to Win, from global crisis to international justice. So I'll see you all there. Thank you very much.